the challenge, the opportunity to connect. The 1960s, a time of imagination and change, a time of anger and fear. The 1960s, a program called Challenge.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen.
Looked at our connections, our divisions, through the lens of faith. Nearly 60 years later, during these challenging times, we'll take a new look at our divisions, our connections, in a new program called Challenge 2.0. The First Amendment to the Constitution states in part, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. It was part of the Bill of Rights, written in 1789 and submitted to the states for ratification. Yet just 1 year later, the Naturalization Act of 1790 restricted citizenship to free white persons of good character. The application of that act proved an obstacle to immigrants of non-Northern European origin, effectively many Jews, Muslims, Hindus, and Buddhists. While the Naturalization Act is no longer formally in place, historians suggest it lives on in fear of and bias against non-whites and non-Christians. Is it possible to bridge such attitudes? That's the subject of this episode of Challenge 2.0. Welcome to Challenge 2.0, and welcome to each of our panelists. Thank you so much for joining us again today. By way of introduction, I'd like to welcome Rabbi Danny Weiner for the second time of being on this program. Thanks so much for coming back and joining us. Danny is a senior rabbi of Temple to Hirsh Sinai, which is campuses, I understand, in both Seattle and Bellevue. Daniel is focused on building Judaism for the 21st century and in healing through social justice. Rabbi Daniel and his community knows firsthand the toxic brew of bias, fear, hatred, some through acts perpetrated right at the temple itself. Reverend Terry Kyllo is often found working with his neighbor here, Aneelah, in what they call faith over fear, standing with our Muslim neighbors roadshow. An ordained Lutheran pastor, he serves both as executive director of the Treacy Levine Center. I also serve that in a different capacity as a board member, and which is a sponsor of this program, and also as director for Neighbors in Faith, a partnership of churches and mosques. We welcome Aneelah Afzali as a repeat panelist, and thank you so much for coming back. After practicing law for some years, Aneelah saw a need to take a break from her legal career to do two things important to you through faith. That is provide service and knowledge. Aneelah serves as executive director of the Muslim Association of Puget Sound, the American Muslim Empowerment Network, also known as MAPS Amen, and was selected, I understand, by Seattle Magazine last year as one of Seattle's most influential. So thank you again and congratulations.
Thank you.
Tom Ikeda brings an historical perspective to our conversation. Tom is the founding executive director of Densho, a third-generation Japanese American whose parents and grandparents were both relocated to concentration camps in Idaho, I believe, during World War II because of their ancestry. The mission of Densho, and we'll talk about this in greater detail, is to both document such stories and to inspire action against intolerance and hysteria, and on the flip side, to promote responsible citizenship.
Exactly. Thank you.
Tom, thank you so much for joining us. I think as we watch the news, and some filtering is very useful, I think, but nonetheless, new examples of bias, fear, and hatred surface, if not every day, every week. Briefly, what example is most memorable and troublesome to each of you? And perhaps, Tom, we might begin with you.
Yeah, sure. The one that really was a gut punch to me was when there was this government policy to separate families at the southern border. And as I saw the children and families going to these camps, it was so reminiscent of what happened to the Japanese American community 75, 76 years ago during World War II. But the chilling thing that really was the gut punch was to recognize how intentional that whole policy was and how it was preceded by essentially a campaign to dehumanize these individuals. So it's just so reminiscent, again, in terms of what happened in the Japanese American community. So that really stood out to me.
Aneelah.
So I have many examples of individual stories from people I know personally, communities that have been impacted. But to me, rather than one instance that really stands out, is some of this continuation of many communities being attacked and the sort of divisiveness and fear that is being driven. And you're seeing it and the parallels that you can draw to other points in history.
We're about a year away from Charlottesville, where a bunch of white supremacists came together carrying tiki torches and shouting that Jews will not replace us. And then the events that took place in subsequent days where a young woman was killed. And in the days following that, a lot of leaders, including business leaders, distanced themselves from President Trump's comments, which were equally horrific, that there were good people on both sides and kind of doing a moral equivalency between the two. And business leaders distanced themselves from those comments. And then just in the last couple of days have now had a meeting with President Trump. And so it's amazing how short our memories are about the terrible things that are happening to dehumanize others and how we just sort of slide back into normal business so quickly.
Rabbi.
Unfortunately, there are so many to choose from in such a short period of time, and I say that with some wry irony, but a heavy heart indeed. And I was just going to say the same thing that you did, that amongst those that really stand out to me, Charlottesville, I think, was seminal, was a watershed, not only because it was encompassing of two long-standing kinds of hate and bigotry against the Jewish people and against African Americans, but because in many ways it set the tone for much of what we've been dealing with today and set the tone for the muted, at best ambivalent, and at worst supportive response of our president for an equivalence between those who want to confront racism and those who are propagators of it.
Such behavior, it's unfortunate to say, is as old as humanity. We've seen this occur in many different countries, but I'd like to begin, if we could, with our own and return to the 30s and especially the 40s, the internment of citizens of Japanese American background heritage in the 1940s. So Tom, perhaps you could give us your unique perspective of that from having experienced it within your own family.
Right. In my opening kind of comments, I talked about sort of the dehumanizing of a group. And so oftentimes, people think about what happened to Japanese Americans, with the bombing of Pearl Harbor at the beginning of World War II. But it was actually decades earlier. You would see politicians and the media, talking about Japanese Americans as being this dangerous group. And really there was almost like no defense against that. It was like we were painted as being something that we weren't, but we just couldn't communicate that. And so with the bombing of Pearl Harbor, it was just so quickly for politicians, the media, and then the general population to pivot to see Japanese Americans, people who've been here for decades or who were born here, as the enemy. And so that essentially led to the mass incarceration of Japanese Americans, over 120,000, who were placed in concentration camps throughout the country, many of them from the Seattle area.
Any other perspectives on that particular case?
Well, you're seeing in a lot of the repetition with the American Muslim community today. And this is why it's actually wonderful to see Japanese Americans really standing up and speaking out against what is happening. The same kind of processes, the same kind of threats, the same kind of narratives that were used against Japanese Americans are now being used against American Muslims. So we're seeing that same, I describe it as sort of the same script with different players and different labels that are used. And that's sort of what's happening right now.
I believe it was the very same day the Supreme Court issued two opinions, one repudiating what was called the Korematsu decision, which allowed the internment and criminal conviction of one particular young man, repudiating that, but at the same time replacing it, or at least enacting that Muslim travel ban. How do each of you reconcile those two acts, those two decisions that came down on the same day? Danny, maybe you might offer something.
I'm not a legal scholar, and I follow this just in the way that those of us who are lay people follow it. But it seems to me that first repudiation is really a whitewashing of the larger policy that was enacted and kind of an excuse. And I think we're seeing a pattern of that, where there seem to be some high-profile but very shallow gestures toward symbolically doing the right thing to distract us or to obscure a much more pernicious policy shift, within our country, and that's incredibly disturbing to me. And again, is one of the ultimate kind of mechanisms of of an emerging authoritarian society.
Very scant evidence, almost no evidence at all, of there being a threat, right? When we know that immigrants tend to obey the laws at higher rates than those who are born in America. And so the same faulty logic, the same attempt to divide Americans with a fig leaf, as Rabbi Danny said, of a repudiation of the Korematsu decision. And it's a sad thing that we can speak out of both sides of our mouth, not only from the terms of politicians, but from the bench of the Supreme Court.
We also had a different kind of sort of hypocrisy or double standard, and that is the intentionality. And what I mean by that, the Sotomayor dissent pointed this out, is the hypocrisy in the majority decision not looking at intention when determining constitutional decision, but looking at intentionality of a state actor in another case that the Supreme Court looked at, the Masterpiece Cake case, where it looked at a state civil rights governmental organization and attributed animus there when they sort of looked at a religious baker who chose not to serve a same-sex couple, but did not look at intention when we're looking at the president, despite his history, despite his campaign trail rhetoric, despite everything he had said and done, and the very purpose that he himself identified as the reason for having this Muslim ban and wanting it. So it was really sort of like when I read that, and I'm an attorney, so when I read that, I was just so bothered, and I appreciated the Sotomayor dissent for calling it out and recognizing that we will, in the future, look back at this decision as one of those that we will regret and hopefully not have to wait 40 years before denouncing it.
Tom, what's your perspective on that?
Back during World War II, the government didn't say that we're going to put Japanese Americans because of their race. They used the national security argument, military necessity, and they hid behind that facade to put Japanese Americans and make it race-based. It was clear to the community and others that this was a race-based decision, but they used, and they realized that, but that wouldn't stand with the Constitution. But they could always say, well, for national security reasons, we need to do this. So Chief Justice Roberts didn't explain that. He just said, of course, this was a horrible mistake because it was based on race, and didn't mention that it was actually originally based on military necessity. And then he turns around and the travel ban is essentially the same argument. We have to do this for national security reasons, but obviously it was for religious bigotry. And that was, again, hiding behind this, again, powerful kind of idea that we have to protect ourselves, but that's not the truth. That's not the real reason.
And just to kind of, reflect the pernicious pattern that's been established, even though Japanese were obviously placed in these camps, German Americans weren't at the time, and there was clearly a racial component to that. However, what's interesting is that the justification for not allowing Jews to immigrate into this country, especially during World War II, was a national security one. And that's where kind of immigration and national security again intersected as it continues to do today, because the claim was that Jews coming from Europe could be German saboteurs or spies, not refugees who are escaping genocide, which is what they were and which is what people knew, but there was a racial and a religious component to that.
But what was really reflective to me is when I asked a group of American Muslim youth, what does the Supreme Court's ruling on the Muslim ban mean to you? And the first response I got immediately from a young American Muslim girl, she said, she said, "Ripper Muslims." And I was like, "What's Ripper Muslims?" She said, "Rest in peace, American Muslims." So even at that young level, they understood that this decision is not about sort of certain countries identified on this Muslim ban, but it's really contributing to the increase of anti-Muslim sentiment in our country, because this really is based on religious bigotry and not some kind of other legal basis. It really is promoting that Islamophobia in our country.
Well, it was interesting to see that as early in our nation's history as 1790, the first what they called Naturalization Act specifically extended citizenship to white immigrants of good character. And that excluded, 3/4, 80% of the globe. And so that tells you that maybe that act is no longer in place, but effectively in attitudes as a foundation of policy that it may still very well be.
Well, and to build upon that, so Japanese, my grandparents who came in the early 1900s, first they had to deal with their own immigration ban, that the United States stopped allowing Japanese to come. But after they came here, they were still ineligible for citizenship. Even though they were here for 30, 40 years, they could not become citizens. And then because they were otherized as ineligible for citizenship, laws were then passed to say, well, because you're ineligible for citizenship, you can't own property. And so for Japanese who were farmers, that was really difficult. So going back in terms of once you start targeting and otherizing a group, then it sort of cascades. It's just part of this process that gets worse and worse.
We see that problem, but it brings up the issue of how can our fellow citizens, all of us, respond to such issues in a way that's ultimately helpful to whatever the community is involved, be it Japanese, American, Muslim, Jewish, whatever the community might be. What would you target, what would you offer up as a useful, helpful response?
We need to get out and vote our conscience and vote in people who have a thoughtful, enlightened perspective on social policy. I mean, quite frankly, it's as simple as that. We can wait around for this investigation and that investigation, and we can get on Facebook and express our ire and even go in the streets and protest, and that's important that popular will is perceived. But when it comes down to it, even with some of the obstacles and things that are happening, gerrymandering and suppression and Russian interference and all of that, if enough people go out and vote in a significant way, because quite frankly, people of goodwill are the majority in this country, that's really where we're at. That's what's going to make the difference.
And I think so often there was a tendency to believe that all is well, and people tended to sit back. We know that the voter participation rates were very low. Is to turn out and not just look at the high-profile races, but essentially all the races on a local level, because it all, as the saying goes, the root of all politics is local politics.
Well, and part of it is that to inform that vote, different communities need to do their own work. So as a Lutheran, there are many Lutherans in Germany in the 1930s that leveraged, that were okay with some negative statements that Martin Luther made about Jews. That were complicit and active in the dehumanization of our Jewish neighbors, or were in denial about it, and participated therefore in a genocide of over 6 million people. I go to congregations, a different one almost every Sunday, and I always bring up Japanese concentration camps. And I ask these congregations, how many of our congregations, did this congregation exist at the time, and if so, did you all serve as allies? Did you say anything in support of your Japanese American sisters and brothers? The reality is, as Americans, it is up to everyone to stand up for the civil and religious liberties of every human being, because that is, in the end, the best way to safeguard our own.
Exactly, and I think part of that is that personal connection, getting to know your Muslim neighbors, your immigrant neighbors, whoever it may be, because that personal connection is really powerful. And I know Terry talks about the power of the potluck, and that's one way, breaking bread together, coming together, building those personal connections. And if you can't have those personal connections yourself, use the power of personal story. Or if you do have connections yourself, use your voice and platform and opportunity to speak publicly about the lives and contributions of the American Muslims for instance.
Yeah, and from a historical perspective, to build on that in terms of the importance of allies and friendships, we often talk about the Japanese Americans who were removed and incarcerated on the West Coast. There were 120,000, and on the West Coast, the Japanese American community pretty much had no allies, and so no one to stand for them. We forget oftentimes that in Hawaii, there were 140,000 Japanese Americans. And there, they were more integrated. They actually had friends who were non-Japanese American, from the Chinese community, from the white population, others. And there were those who stood up for the Japanese American community. The Japanese Americans in Hawaii were not removed and not placed in camps, even though they were in the center of the Pacific where it was attacked. On the West Coast, we were all removed.
To what degree do you think the bias that we're seeing manifested in all sorts of different acts today is based on that sense of, whether different than I am, and therefore we need to be suspicious, we need to separate ourselves? Or do you think there are some other realities of modern life that are helping amplify that?
Well, I would just argue that if you take bias and you add scarcity, right, which builds a lot of anxiety in human beings, and then you add to that intentional dehumanization on the part of the leaders of this country, that you're looking at a violent situation, right? And so there is bias, and sadly, bias against all kinds of groups tends to grow and stay in families and communities over a long period of time, get institutionalized. And then we've seen over the last 50 years that manufacturing output and worker productivity has gone up 250%. Wages have only gone up 12%. And so there is 40% of Americans can't afford the basics. 90% of the wealth in this country is owned by 0.1%. So there's a lot of folk out there who are biased, but who are also experiencing intense economic sort of fear and dislocation. And then when you add to that the scapegoating language about Muslims and Mexicans and other immigrants that is taking place, calling immigrants vermin, that kind of intentional dehumanization creates a situation of violence that actually makes all of us less safe and makes us less true to not only our religious values, but to our American ones.
And that brings to question, what is the larger cost of all of this? What does it cost to us as a country, as a society, as individual people of this fear, this bias, this prejudice, this acting out?
That's one of my greatest fears, is that the intensity of what's going on right now, we've let something horrific out of the box, as it were, and that even when this political period passes, we may be unable to put that back in the box so quickly.
So what do we do? What is the best response to this? You mentioned vote, but what are some things, especially for the groups that are being subjected to bias or the various manifestations of that, what would be your recommendations for people watching right now for them to do?
Yeah, let me answer that first with a little bit more in terms of the impact of this. From a personal standpoint, having talked to thousands of Japanese Americans who lived through the war and the experiences, it devastated people and families. I mean, sometimes we forget that lives were changed because of this experience, and many of them never recovered. The level of suicides went up in our community and things like that. And yet I know also from these stories that when people outside the community reach out to help, to stand with them, it made a huge difference. There was, in my family, for instance, my uncle was killed in action, fighting for the U.S. Army in Europe. And the memorial service was in a concentration camp in Idaho where my grandparents accepted this flag. A Jesuit priest saw this, and he brought the family back to Seattle. They were the first family to come back to Seattle during the war, and they helped that family. To us, in my family, in our community, those acts of kindness were everything in terms of helping us. You feel like we were American, and that was really important.
Yeah. And I would add that the trauma is certainly long-term. So there's no doubt about the impact that these kinds of policies, proposals, and rhetoric has. Building the personal connections, as I said before, is really critical. Getting to know your neighbors and really building sort of joining coalitions and joining movements to help understand how interconnected we are. And then using your platform, whatever opportunity you have, to publicly and vocally speak out against policies that demonize any community and really help support all communities, particularly the ones who are being attacked, marginalized, and dehumanized. And part of the speaking out that I emphasize is talking about the humanity of the groups that are being dehumanized. So for instance, when talking about the American Muslim community, our fellow Americans can talk about the positive contributions and lives and not go into theological debates or arguments or anything else, or even the factual statistical information, because unfortunately in this day and age, facts don't matter. Right? Facts don't change hearts and minds. But what does is the personal connection or the personal stories that people can share.
It's time for communities of faith, particularly those that comprise more of a majority in this country, specifically Christian communities, to stand up and be counted, and to do that publicly. And I know that through the work I've done, there are occasionally letters that come into the bishop's office saying that they're unhappy with the work that I'm doing. And our bishop writes them back and very gently says, we're sorry to see you go. But the reality is leaders have to stand up right now and remember what is at the heart and core of their tradition. As a Christian, as a part of the Abrahamic tradition, it is that every person is made in the image of God.
I just wanted to add too that one of the ways people can take action is to support the organizations and the efforts that are there on the front lines, like the work that Pastor Terry and I are doing. Supporting organizations that are there doing this kind of work, because we can't do it without the support of our neighbors.
And Danny, I know your temple has been out in the forefront of many of those social justice issues and acts that are going on. Perhaps leave us with one final bit of wisdom on that.
I know I don't mean to be a broken record about this, but there are, especially amongst young people, there's this sense that both sides are the same and that it's really two sides of the same coin. If this last election has not demonstrated in a profound and indelible way that there is a distinction between people that you vote for, I don't know what will.
Well, and I would thank each of you. Each of you is making such a difference in your own respective communities, and I thank you for helping make a difference as part of this program. Hope you'll come back and participate again, and I thank each of you for tuning in to Challenge 2.0. Hope to see you again next week.